Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to another distinguished lecture series at Janki Devi Memorial College being organized by the English Department. We would like to thank and welcome Dr. Swati Pal, who is our principal, for allowing us this space to organize an event like this. Thank you, Dr. Pal. Let me introduce you to our two guests today. We are privileged to have amongst us Professor Peter Marx. He is a world-renowned German theatre and performance studies scholar. He holds the chair of Theatre and Media Studies at the University of Cologne, where he functions also as the director of the theatre archive there. His work focuses on the metropolitan culture at the beginning of the 20th century, contemporary theatre, and Shakespearean performance. Professor Marx has been also associated as a faculty member with the universities of Mainz, Columbia University in New York City, Freie University, University of Bern, and many more. He's a member of the executive committee of IFTR, which is International Federation for Theatre Research. He has published in various journals and has a number of books to his credit. In 2018 came out his monograph, Hamlet's Voyage to Germany. We welcome you, Professor Marx. Also, we have Dr. Sofie Taubert. Dr. Taubert is a lecturer at the Institute for Media and Culture and Theatre Studies and Theatre Collection at the University of Cologne, Germany. Her research interests are music theatre, Shakespeare's reception, visual reception, theatre historiography, scenery, and stage effect in the 19th century. Her PhD, The Scene of the Marvelous, Shakespeare's Fairies in Music Theatre in the Interplay of Music and Machinery, was awarded with the Martin Lenwood Prize and was published in 2018. We welcome you, Dr. Taubert. Now I'll invite our principal, Dr. Pal, to please come and we will do the planting of the trees. So we're going to have this in our college and with your name and placard on these forever for you to see in future when you visit us again, and I hope you do. So please.
You'll be able to see them blossom and grow. You just need to water them. This belongs to you, but in our college. Thank you.
Dr. Pal, if you could also give us a welcome souvenir to our guests.
This is something for you. This is our college.
Thank you so much.
And this is a little bell, so there's okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So we'll begin with our first talk, Dr. Taubert.
By the tree. I never got that, and it really, it's really nice. Thank you very much. So, what I'm going to do today is to walk you a bit through the reception story of A Midsummer Night's Dream in Germany. And I'm starting in the 18th century and I'm trying in the last part to make an overview onto the films in the 20th century. Central. I was about to start by presenting your music. I will do that now a bit later, but I need to work around that. So my central question is, how do we find an aesthetic language for something which is invisible, as the fairies are or the magic are? And there's for the Shakespearean that did not really pose a problem. Already in the late 17th century that kind of became a problem. So contemporaries did not really know what to do with the piece. So they kept on reading it, they really liked it, but the question was how, or it seemed to be unstageable. And I think that depends on that the fairies are received as something different, something superhuman, something which is outside the human laws of physical order, of a certain time frame, and so there is a gap, and every time kind of needs to find a solution for that. So I'm dividing this talk in three major steps. The first part is the problem of a lack of visuality. The second is the question of how sound became a solution to overcome that problem. And the second major part is how a visuality develops. So let me start by giving you this, presenting you this poster. It's not Midsummer, but it's a Macbeth. But in the figures of the marvelous, it has a similar problem. So it's meant to just announce a performance, but it has this kind of very long paragraph of explanation. So this is what it says. Today's tragedy is one of the greatest and most beautiful pieces by famous Shakespeare. The prophecies of witches and the magicians, as well as all sorts of appearances are very special. And although such jugglery must offend the connoisseur in most pieces, everyone has to admit that in Shakespeare they are well interesting, and our today's Macbeth will prove that one does wrong if one cuts them off, or if one adds or removes too much from a genius masterpiece. So what can we get out of this poster? Obviously, the company feels an urgent need to justify the performance, especially the employment of the marvelous scene and the magic. And this rhetoric might be a mixture of economic interests, educational, as well as the taste of the audience. But in hinting to the fact that they did neither cut nor added scenes, we find a second interesting information. So they refer to the common practice of transforming Shakespeare's plays. And the background is here, the Enlightenment movement and the theatre reformists trying to tame theatre, or try to tame the more improvisational theatre forms of earlier times. So the central idea of theatre and its purpose had changed in the 18th century. Rather than to entertain, the bourgeois theatre was meant to educate. In contrast to earlier theatres, the theatre aesthetics undergo a process of disciplining. Instead of improvisation and body action, it is literally text which gets into focus normative ideas get more and more established, and spokesman you might have heard of are Johann Christoph Gottsched, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Goethe, or Denis Diderot, just to mention, just to give you a framework of whom we are talking about. In order to educate, dramatic art had to keep rules. As in the Aristotelian model, theatre should keep the unity of place, time, and characters. It should not mix people from different social classes, as well as comic or tragic elements. And if you kind of go through your personal lecture of Shakespeare's text, it's very obvious that he does not fit into that model. So he mixes up characters from different social backgrounds. He has super comic scenes next to very tragic ones, and everything that kind of feels uncomfortable for the 18th century. Because they think you need to address the human mind and not kind of the lower interests of bodily action or spectacular sceneries or kind of all these more emotional things. And following this development, especially Shakespeare's fairy plays, The Tempest and Midsummer Night's Dream pose a problem for the stage. The Midsummer Night's Dream was the most read piece of the time. And I brought you a quote from England just to give you an idea how this rhetoric kind of was done, or kind of sounds. So Phelps writes in 1853, every reader of Shakespeare is disposed to regard A Midsummer Night's Dream as the most essentially unactable of all his plays. The words, the characters speak, are so completely spiritual that they are best felt when they are not spoken. Their exquisite beauty is like that of sunset colors, which no mortal artist can interpret faithfully. So that's your problem. It is the end of the century which kind of changes this discourse. And music and sound became seen as a way to overcome this dilemma. And a central source is a very small essay by Ludwig Tieck, who's one of the first translators of Shakespeare in Germany as well. And the essay is called Shakespeare's Treatment of the Marvelous in The Tempest. And then he states, the fantasy is captivated by sound already in advance, and severe reason is put asleep. From this course we can accept some magic fairy tales in operettas or in music theatre, which would be in a spoken theatre, evoke our deepest aversion. So he has a very strong rhetoric. So it's kind of, in spoken theatre that would not be possible, but then maybe we can have an exception in the music theatre. And here is another one by Marmontel. The music constitutes the charm of the marvelous, and the marvelous gives reason to the music. So one enters a new world. So this is kind of, music is received as something different from reason, and here maybe there's some space for fairy music. In this sense, Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy hit a nerve. Then, after reading Shakespeare in the 1820s, wrote a music called for A Midsummer Night's Dream. He was writing an overture, and after a first private performance, the music became most popular. And immediately the music was received as ideal translation of Shakespearean spirit. Still, it was not a stage performance, but at least it seemed to kind of solve the dilemma, or kind of, it was a possibility of transform the Shakespearean language. And I'll now try to make it beautiful. Have you heard this music before? Who has? Yeah. Okay. I'm glad. That proves my that proves part of my argument. With this piece and several of kind of people who wrote music in that spirit or in that sense, there is something like a code for fairy music. This music becomes really coined, and it is until today recognizable. And if you kind of we come back to that later, because it's also kind of still reappearing or echoing in quite a lot of Shakespeare or some Midsummer Night's Dream stagings and screenings today. So what is sound? It's based on on clarinets and flutes, on very high strings. It's a very light and a very transparent sound. It's not a melody which sticks with us, but it's a very structural, like ornamental music, and it has something like a flittering impression which keeps our attention. Here it's not very much supported by the temperature, but the whole music kind of transpires an atmosphere of a, let's say, European summer night. And the language and scenery of Shakespeare's plays are kind of transmitted into music. So you can hear maybe the sound of a summer meadow with kind of small insects flittering around you. So we kind of slowly approach the visuality. And the question is, what kind of fairy world is evoked in that music? And I will tell you an anecdote which is provided by Mendelssohn's friend Schubert, and there he kind of tells us how he and Mendelssohn has kind of walked through the landscape, and they're lying down in a meadow, and at some point a rather big fly crossed their way, and he heard this humming of a fly, and then he said, well, that's how a Midsummer Night's Dream must sound. And this fly is indeed represented in a small motif in the cello in the music. But in the whole, it is the first ornamental-like structure which became a symbol for a small, delicate and flighty imagined fairies. So they are small creatures, and they kind of somehow get connected to insects. And this imagery appears in the context of two other developments. So one thing is, on the page of Shakespeare, it had been much earlier. So for example, Titania addresses fairies with the following lines. Some to kill cankers in the musk rose buds, some wore the free mice for their lantern wings, to make my small elves coats, and some keep back the glamorous all that nightly hoods of wonders at our quaint spirits. This imagery is matched by the illustrations in text editions of Shakespearean dramas, which arise around 1800 and become widely distributed with the progressing technique of printing. And these images are from books like the Shakespeare Gallery illustrations about Shakespeare's play, or the literal and graphical illustration of Shakespeare and so on. There's quite a lot of kind of publications done illustrated with these kind of small fairies. So. But there's yet another source, and that is a technological development. The thing in the first half of the 19th century, there is an increasing interest in optics and processes of seeing, causing inventions such as the stereoscope or the cinematograph later. And these technologies do not only influence the stage, but also cause a change in the perceptions, as I will, on visual perception, as I will show you in a minute. And I am hereby following the line of argument by Francesca Britton, who showed how the invention and mass distribution of the microscopes has not only influenced the fairy sound, but also the fairy painting. And she argues that the microscope allows to receive the world of insects and plants as a microcosm, as unsealed realm, full of bright colors, of material, full of wings, tentacles, glitter, and so on. And kind of, if you follow that line of thinking, you kind of, it's very obvious how they there's a lot of very interesting material in that world. Britton writes, microscopy itself was a discipline teetering between the scientific and the fabulous. In the first half of the 19th century, inexpensive and portable instruments along with improved magnifying technologies made microscopes available and attractive to an ever-widening public, and fostered an upsurge of interest in the natural science. Similarly located between experience and fantasies are the figures of the marvelous as the spirits in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. And Britton continues in reference to Sir Joseph Noel Paton's The Crow of Oberon and Titania. I'm sorry. No, it's not there, but this is kind of close. Paton's fairy world is simultaneously the real world, which has been magnified and sharpened with the aid of 19th century technology. And already bound to nature in Shakespeare, as we have seen, the fairy sign became now informed by insects such as beetles and butterflies. We find dainty shapes, tender wings, sensors, and antennas. They are flying and they are mingled upon flowers and forests' ash. Thereby, the new visual language appeared first for the fairy folk and for the serving fairies. And as we have seen also in the illustration, Oberon and Titania seem to be a different kettle of fish, so they still belong to the imagery of the 18th century. So they are imagined as something superhuman, but it's rather linked to antique gods. So they appear in Roman costumes, or like Baroque angels, or whatever. But it's a very different visual language. Yeah, let's get to the next step. There's Mendelssohn's music helped to approach A Midsummer Night's Dream. It still took another 20 years until the first stage performance of the piece of the first kind of which stick to Shakespeare and which stick to Shakespearean text. In London that was in 1840, and the first German staging was in 1943, and both are connected to Mendelssohn's music. So, following the music, we can also see a shift in the visual language of the spirits. But we see the same syncopation which we had seen in the illustrations. While Oberon and Titania are still imagined as antique gods, the fairy folk is clearly inspired by the microcosm of insects. And this is the Berlin performance. And it is this Berlin performance by Ludwig Tieck and Mendelssohn which becomes super iconic and shapes reception of the piece up to the 20th century. It's not just the music which kind of is very opulent and very far from a Shakespearean stage, that kind of had a rather empty stage, but also the visuality is kind of very rich and very pictorial and very concrete in the imaginations. And I brought you another review. It's an 1853 production, but it still kind of expresses that connection. The fairies, as they glide in and out of the trees of foliage, give you a notion that they have actually stepped out of them, as though their trunks and flowers were their natural abiding places. And by long residence, they had become imbued with the color of them. There were none of your winged white, there were none of your white muslin fairies with spangles and bands. So it has shifted, and just I just show you two later. So this is how they developed until 1900. So what I think is interesting is that the fairies who seem to be unstageable at the end of the 18th century, they have kind of collected some aesthetic patterns, and now it's possible to approach them and to bring them into shape. And on one hand it's the music, and on the other hand it's a certain visual language or certain costume. And as I promised you, I will walk you into the 20th century. Here, these are images of Max Reinhardt's film from 1935-36. It's not his first Midsummer Night's Dream, but it's his first work for the film, and it's very interesting that he again takes the fairy piece to to find his way into the new form, into a medium which is new for him. But as you can see, you recognize the visual language, and I'm sorry that you can't hear it. But if you enter it into YouTube, you can also get the clips, and it comes again with Mendelssohn's music, which is kind of adapted throughout the whole film, and they moving accordingly to that shivering sound. And there are two further examples, and I'm going to talk about the version by Michael Hoffman, A Midsummer Night's Dream from 1999. Does someone know the film? I got 4. The story here takes place in an Italian village, but it opens with the wedding march from the Mendelssohn music. It is presented to us with a gramophone. And within this kind of opening scenes, you see the fairies coming from the forest to the city by night, and they grab the gramophone and they steal it and they bring it back to the forest. And it's a very interesting connection again, which arises between the fairies and that technology. And as it plays again the Mendelssohn music, or sometimes the music is played by the gramophone, sometimes it appears. It allows for very interesting reflection on questions of something like cultural heritage, of something like what does a quotation mean? What are the echoes of a certain aesthetic decision? What background or history is inscribed into these motifs? And it's very interesting how here, through this gramophone used by the fairies, or not used by the fairies, but stolen by the fairies, brings us to questions of repetition, of media technology, how is the notion extended of the perception of sound and presence, and what is where do we experience music, and how is that transformed if you record music and bring it somewhere else? And I really like this scene. There I brought image and you can't see it, I'm sorry. But this is bottom surrounded by the fairies of Titania, and they actually use the recordings, the plates, and they put food on it, and then they put it on the gramophone, but the gramophone does not work. And then bottom, the enchanted bottom comes and takes the food away, and then he shows them how to use the gramophone, and all of a sudden the music comes again. Are we still in time? Are we still in time? So just briefly, a second example, that is Woody Allen's A Midsummer Night's Sex Comedy. Again, an adaptation of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. And here we see no fairies at all. But they are present the whole time. And that is, again, on the one hand, because of the music by Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, but on the other hand, because it's kind of cut against scene shots towards the nature, and you see inside butterflies or small rabbit, and they kind of move accordingly to the music. And I think that is kind of a very crucial moment that you the image and the bodies and the music kind of gets put into one rhythm or gets kind of mixed up. So to sum it up, in the late 18th century, the fairies pose a problem to the aesthetic of the stage. Why have I started with the 18th century anyway? This is the time when Shakespeare gets rediscovered in Germany, and it's also the time when he kind of gets translated into German for the first time. So that's why that's also the time when they need to kind of get their heads around what to do with Shakespeare. So the challenge of a fairy magic on stage is they need, as they are not part of the humans, they need to overcome the humans, and that is on stage or in the performative. It's possible through a certain multi-layeredness. So it's the combination of a sound and a movement, or of something animal-like and something human-like. So they need something extraordinary in their combination in order to kind of create, to make us believe in that. So that's the point. And on the other hand, the fairy magic gives us a short leaf. So they provide the possibility to kind of to try something else, to leave the human restrictedness to physics, to time, to language, to whatever. So here is the possibility to invent something new, but also to reflect on our habits, to reflect on kind of certain patterns of behavior. And here, or what I wanted to show you in this, it's here in special, there's a possibility of reflection also on technology, and especially via technology. How do we see? How do we perceive? What kind of challenges do we have to overcome when it comes to sensual perception, to visual perception, and sound? So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Taubert. I would request all of you to hold on to your questions. Let's listen to Professor Peter Marx now, and then when both the speakers have spoken, we'll have a round of question and answer sessions.
invitation to be here. Thank you for the generous welcome. And allow me at the same time to express my relief that since you have sort of planted a tree in my name, that I don't have to take care of it myself. I'm terrible with plants. I know that it's in good hands, and I promise if I'm allowed to come back, I'll make sure to look how it grows. But it's good that it's not under my watch. So, since Sofie has acquainted you with Shakespeare in Germany, which sort of is this weird, sort of seems to be a match made in heaven, because Germans are so obsessed with Shakespeare, I would like to follow up on a slightly different note, on a slightly different facet. Clearly, as Sofie has shown, Shakespeare was instrumental in shaping the transition of German identity from the 18th century, from the Age of Enlightenment, through the process of modernization of the 19th and early 20th century. What I would like to address in my paper is, as I call it slightly presumptuously, Shakespeare in Germany and the invention of modern politics. So to what extent does the reception of Shakespeare help to format an idea about political identity, the political discourse in 20th century Germany? And allow me to sort of remind you of some of the key dates of the 20th century from the German perspective. In 1919, the Great War, the World War I ends, which in Germany leads to the major political shift of the Kaiser abdicating. Actually, that's a very gentle expression. He rather flees Germany by night. And literally overnight, Germany becomes a republic. A republic with the most liberal constitution, which really could have been one of the major political achievements, hadn't this republic been doomed by the fact that it was inhabited by too few Democrats and too few Republicans who sort of really would uphold the democratic order. So in 1933 we see the rise of the Nazi Party, the seizure of power through Hitler, which leads to the Second World War in 39 to 45. And in 49, the realm of what is today Germany is divided in two different states, the Federal Republic, on which I will focus a little later, and the German Democratic Republic, which sort of runs on a socialist scheme. In 1989, this period of state division comes to an end with the fall of the Berlin Wall and subsequently the reunification of Germany in 1990. So this is more or less the framework on which I will look. The underlying hypothesis of my talk is the assumption that with the end of the Kaiserreich in 1919, Germany really was faced with the necessity to reinvent itself as a new political system. And that in this process, staging Shakespeare, receiving Shakespeare, was instrumental in forming new political identities. So therefore, I'll divide my talk in 4 parts, which sort of through exemplary productions will try to give you an impression of this political century of German history. So let's look at banning the demon of the pure will to power, which is a Nietzsche quotation, by looking at a production of Richard III in 1920. But allow me first an introductory remark on the political circumstances of Germany at the end of the Kaiserreich. The Kaiserreich was, in contrast to its political imagery, a rather short-lived political unity. It had come into existence in 1871 and it lasted for about 40 years. And it was coined by an interesting cultural and social tension between an old aristocratic elite on the one hand, which basically provided the membership of the military and administrative ranks on the one side, and an economic and intellectual elite, liberal elite on the other side, that was more or less barred from any form of participation in running the state on the other hand. The most famous representatives of the later one are members of the German Jewish elite who sort of were systematically discriminated against and barred from any form of political participation. So this is certainly not the only reason for the defeat in World War I, but it's one of the reasons that Germany sort of had this difficult situation to come to terms with its modernization. The American historian Fritz Stern once termed the very insightful phrase saying, cultural mobility was the motor of development in Germany, and at the same time its biggest trauma. The motor of change and the trauma at the same time. I think it's this Jan's face, this schizophrenic outline that sort of also runs through the formation of a new political identity after 1990. Because suddenly the melancholia for the old political system still was very present. But one of the key places where this actually was acted out in a physical, in a very specific, very concrete sense, was the former court theater in Berlin, which overnight, since there was no court anymore, had become the Berlin State Theater. Where do we go? Okay, sorry. Was the Berlin State Theater. The newly elected democratic government picked Leopold Jessner as head of this new state theater. He was a renowned director, but first and foremost, he was also a social democrat and he was a Jew. So he became literally the representative of the new liberal culture that so far had been more or less marginalized by the political elites of the Kaiserreich. And one of his leading actors was Fritz Kortner, born as Fritz Nathan Kohn in Vienna, also Jewish, also a left liberal, and the two of them sort of clearly are the most visible representatives of the democratic culture of the Weimar Republic. Jessner starts his term as head of the theater by staging a play that was very popular in Germany. It's Schiller's Wilhelm Tell. It's a Swiss legend about a partisan hero. And usually the play gives ample opportunity for lavishly staging the Alps. You know, Europeans are obsessed by the Alps, but I also learned that it sometimes comes up in Indian movies because it's an exotic place. Believe me, for a European it's also an exotic place. But Jessner deliberately refused to go with these patterns. Instead, he turned Wilhelm Tell into a parable about an uprising, about creating a new political subject. And he did a similar thing with Richard III by Shakespeare, a play so far well introduced at the German stage, but understood more as a kind of masterpiece for a virtuoso actor. And Jessner made it an ardent political play. He did so mainly through the scenery of Emil Kirchner. As you might see already, this is a very abstract space. It doesn't give you any indication of the early modern period or late medieval period of English history. It's a mere abstraction, and this was on purpose. The stage was meant to be sort of a condensation of the interpretation of the play. And the interpretation was understood by Jessner as a stern revision of the bourgeois canon, answering to the question to what extent canonical texts still can stand for the new political order. As you can see from these sketches, sort of Kirchner envisioned a place that sort of was governed by color, by light and shadows, and it was meant to be emblematic in the sense that what was seen was not sort of already a ready to take away message, but rather something that needed to be interpreted and worked through. Interestingly also, you see that Kirchner deliberately constructed a space that would be divided vertically. So you would not only have, as usual at the beginning of the 20th century, a horizontal stage, but also a stage that would give ample opportunities to sort of allow for movement gesturing on the vertical axis. Fritz Kortner as Richard III went not for a psychological, realistic interpretation, but rather for an over-exaggerated expressionist interpretation of the character. On the left, you see the sketch by Emil Kirchheim, and already the sketch by Kirchheim, it's not very nice. And Kortner sort of in his autobiography repeatedly reflects on what he describes as his ugliness. Allegedly, Leopold Jessner, when he had the first interview with Kortner about getting a contract, looked at Kortner and said, "Oh my gosh, are you ugly?" And this ugliness sort of becomes instrumental in creating Richard III as a demon of pure will to power, as an egomanic, bound by no values, bound by no interests, value of power that sort of works on a system of competition and constant rivalry. And you see on the photograph that Kortner deliberately even turns his hand into a claw as to show that he's rather a demon, a monster, than a human being. Here, another photograph that underlines this. Clearly also, Kirchheim's set design and Jessner's staging echoes the 1920s expressionist film. You see the play of light and shadows as it's known for movies like Dr. Caligari, like the Fritz Lang movies, and you clearly see that here emerges a visual space that is at the intersection of different media. And again, I guess this plays into Sophie's argument that sort of the stage becomes an invitation to reflect on the mediality, on modes of representation, and also on the political meaning. The quintessence of Kirchheim's design and also of Jessner's production was a huge stage, imitated repeatedly during the 1920s, even dubbed the Jessner stage. Sorry? Is it too dark? Sort of, which appears in the third act when Richard is crowned as King of England. The stage itself was colored in red and black, the red symbolizing all the blood that had to be shed for Richard to become king. And if you look at Richard's gesture, sort of with a raised right arm, he's triumphant, and at the same time we recognize he's the next to fall. And if you look at the figures on the left and the right, they are almost crippled by being part of this political system. So Jessner and Kirchheim and Kortner created an interpretation of Richard III that reflected on a ruthless political system that would deform people simply by entering, that would dehumanize them and would eventually bring them down and kill them. I cannot help but think that the Polish philosopher Jan Kot, famous dramaturg of the 20th century, must have thought of this image when he wrote this article on the Shakespeare history plays, where he states that the history plays depict the political system as a great staircase fueled by blood and violence, and that it's just an opportunity to rise as it is an opportunity to fall. What is interesting about the Kirchheimian set design is that this staircase literally leads to nothing else but itself. It becomes a symbol of the vertical axis of political rise and also the potential of political fall. As with many other of Jessner's productions, the opening night was literally a battle in the audience. It was much fought over, and it was considered to be a deep provocation to the bellum decorum that usually was presented at the court theater. But in hindsight, we might read this as a success for Jessner's program to politicize theater as a prism to revise our own imagery and to rethink it to what extent it's able to cater a democratic and liberal society. But it would be sort of running too short if we stick with the achievements of the Weimar Republic. The failure of the Weimar Republic is at least as symptomatic as its achievements. So the abdication of the Kaiser in 1919 also fueled fantasies about the return of the monarch, the return of the king, and the return often heroic age. It was the director and principal Saladin Schmidt in the small town of Bochum, in the highly industrial Ruhr area of Germany, that sort of set out to create a totally different approach to the Shakespearean history plays. His ideal was to read the history plays as one cycle about power and the rise and demise of power. I spare you sort of, I once created a diagram that drove my students nuts because I had so many arrows in it, so I spared you the visuals, but if you consider the entirety of the Shakespearean history plays, it works pretty well as a triangle. You have Richard II, sort of the incapable king. You have Henry IV, usurping power to save the monarchy. You have Henry V, the good king, the only one who survives to play with his name, right? Keep that in mind. Then you have, then it goes down to Henry VI, 1, 2, 3, the king who doesn't want to be king, one of my favorite plays. And then Richard III, the pure will to power. And Saladin Schmidt sort of was driven by this idea to read and to present theatrically the Shakespearean history plays as an equal to Richard Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung. So we see there is this longing, this urge for mythical thinking, also amidst the Weimar Republic and amidst the context of a democratic society. In 1927, Saladin Schmidt was able to lure the German Shakespeare Association, the Deutsche Shakespeare Gesellschaft, which sort of praises itself for being one of the oldest still existing literary societies, from its traditional meeting point in Weimar to Bochum, with a promise to present the complete staging of the history plays in one go. It was sort of divided over 3 or 4 days, and really was meant to provide an anti-democratic, mythical staging of these history plays. As we can gather, because there's unfortunately very few visual documentation, but as you can gather from the set designs of Johannes Schröder, Schröder provided, in contrast to Kirchheim, a play that already sort of exceeded the scale of the human. Schröder's spaces are always too big for the man who lived in them. And we might read this as a kind of melancholic take on the political reality of the Weimar Republic, of a generation sort of that is not able to live up to the heritage of its fathers and ancestors. I brought you a sketch from Schröder's sketchbook. This is actually for a 1945 production of Richard III, but he used the same design in 1927. And you see how the stage is almost sort of diminished by these overtowering figures of kings and bishops of the past. So clearly, this was an anti-democratic, a revisionist perception of its day, presenting the present day as something that is not ready to live up to the expectations and to the promises made to them. I also would like to note on the side, because I will come back to that a little bit later, it becomes obvious that Shakespeare, as is so often discussed in Shakespeare studies, is neither a democratic author nor an anti-democratic author. Shakespeare is just a good playwright, and he caters to whatever you try to make out of him. Almost. You can also batch productions, but I'm sure you've seen many of them yourself. So let me come to my third point, the rise of the hero, the fascist dream, Richard II. As you might gather from my brief mark on the side about Richard II, Richard II is not really the play to sort of bring a hero in the limelight, because the protagonist actually is a king who is incapable of being king, but only has the virtue of being king. That's his only qualification. And I just remind you briefly that there is a very famous reflection on Richard II by the German-American historian Ernst Kantorowicz in his book on the King's Two Bodies. So reflecting on this medieval political theory that the king actually is comprised of two different bodies, the body natural and the body politic. And Kantorowicz takes Richard II as his test case. In 1937, the director Jürgen Fehling, along with the set designer Traugott Müller, had produced a staging of Richard III. A production that in hindsight is considered to be very controversial because, as many of the cast members recall it, this Richard III resembled Joseph Goebbels, one of the leading propagandists of the Nazi terror regime. This is a difficult argument because it also is a part of a self-defense of those artists who sort of were more or less in compliance with the Nazi regime, saying we did quite a lot of oppositional work, but we have very few sources. So, since it is so difficult to make sense of this 1937 production, I suggest instead to look at the 1939 production of Richard II, so the play preceding Richard III. You see that the set design is remarkable in its abstraction. In contrast to what we otherwise see on the Nazi stage, Traugott Müller, who had been a very provocative set designer in the Weimar Republic, he worked together with Erwin Piscator, who was known for his political productions, provided a space that was almost completely empty and abstract. And he just had this very few elements, as you can see here, this raised balcony, but you can also see that Traugott Müller almost revealed the machinery of the stage. For example, if you look at the clouds in the background, so he didn't make the least effort to produce an illusionistic scenery, but he wanted to barely open the theater as a machinery of illusion. The title role of Richard II was performed by Gustav Gründgens, who was head of the Berlin State Theater, and at the same time was an acclaimed and celebrated actor, but always also surrounded by the rumors about his homosexuality, something that almost brought him down in 1935 when he was playing Hamlet on the same stage. So interestingly, he appears as this incapable King Richard II, and it is the actor Bernard Minetti kneeling here on the left side who appears as Bolingbroke as his opponent. And if we look at the reviews, and there are ample of reviews of this production, if we look at the reviews, they almost unisono praise the Bolingbroke of Minetti as the new generation of the future leader. So here, clearly Richard II becomes this, what I call, fascist dream of the arriving hero, the one who's born to lead, and not the one who's born to be king. So we see this transition of the political concept of kingdom from something that is hereditary, that sort of is a mythical category handed down through the crown, to the question of who is capable of leading the people, who's capable of leading the nation. And of course this also reflects Hitler's own public persona, where he sort of, since he had only been a very simple private in World War I, sort of depicted himself as the chosen one who, despite his military rank, was meant to rise to the height. This is what is reflected in this 1939 production of Richard II. So how does Shakespeare and the history plays come into play after 1945? The general discourse about remembering in the Bonner Republic was determined by at least one decade of suppressing any memories of the Third Reich. The famous psychoanalyst Alexander and Margarete Mitscherlich wrote a book with the telling title The Incapacity to Mourn, Die Unfähigkeit zu trauern, to describe the psychological predisposition of the post-war generation. This shifted remarkably in the 1960s, when a new generation sort of came out of school and started to question the perspective of their parents and grandparents. Fritz Kortner, who as a Jew had to flee Germany already in 1933 and returned in 48-49, Fritz Kortner became one of the leading authorities when it came to the question of denazificating the German theater. He shifted from being an actor, to mostly directing plays. And he picked up the program of Leopold Jessner to sternly questioning the bourgeois canon to what extent it was fit not only for a democratic society, but also for dealing with the past crimes of the Nazi period. So his 1963 production of Richard III in Berlin became again a major scandal because Kortner sort of lavishly staged the terrors of war and the terrors of violence that sort of is in the background of the play. Well, this was something that was stylized in the 1919 production. Kortner clearly brought it to the foreground. And it lasted to the extent that the audience considered to be offensive. In 1964, only 1 year after Kortner's production, Peter Zadek, born to a Jewish family that had emigrated from Central Europe to England at the beginning of the 1930s, and who had returned or had sort of migrated to Germany in the 1960s, produced a production of Henry V. Remember, the only one who survives his own play? And Zadek depicted Henry V as the product of the language of propaganda. You see that he was, in an almost collage-like way, was using the imagery of war propaganda from the British side, from the French side, and he was using, or sort of was restaging, a famous picture of victory parades to sort of load the Shakespearean play with some historical currency to make clear to what extent the myth of the hero would be just an awful simplification if we wouldn't go for the political implications and the political facets that underlie the play. I don't know whether you can sort of probably see the picture on the right. It depicts Henry sort of standing in pose for a portrait on horse, sort of where you can also see that Zadek also dealt with this question of trans-historical translations. In 1967, Peter Palic was literally a disciple of Bertolt Brecht. He had been one of Brecht's assistants at the Berlin Ensemble in the early 1950s. Who then sort of moved from the GDR to the Federal Republic, staged again a cycle version of the history plays, but in contrast to Saladin Schmidt, he didn't aim for the tale of the heroic, but rather called it War of the Roses. And the attempt was to highlight again a political system that was cruel, brutal, and based on military on a military rule. What is remarkable, the set design is by the artist Minx. What is remarkable that you clearly see the influence of Brecht on Palic. It's an abstract, almost empty space that only needs a couple of props to evoke a certain historical period. And you see on the right picture that Minx produced a frieze-like emblem of the experience of war, with skeletons, destroyed weapons, sort of just as a constant reminder. This would be always, would be above all the scenes, reminding us that war was intrinsic to this tale about power. And finally, let me end this brief glance on post-war Shakespearean productions with a glance on the Belgian director Luc Perceval. When Indo was a visiting fellow this summer in Cologne, we took her to a Parzival production which was awful. So I guess I take my chance of a shot to show that Parzival can also be a good director, right? So this one was terrible, but give him a chance. He really sometimes knows what he wants to do. And in 1999, Le Parzival produced really a cyclical production of the history plays in one go. It lasted for 10 to 12 hours. It was meant sort of to go through the night. The audience would go with the history through the night. And it's a remarkable production because it begins with all the decorum of a classical play. People speak in meter, it's very abstract, it's very stylized, and ends up in a slang-like, rap-like, aggressive monologue, which is what has been left of Richard III. Here again, and you see two screenshots from the video recording. Parzival systematically works with abstraction, and this is what is kept from the battle at Agincourt, which sort of is this triumphant moment in Henry V. But with Parzival, it's just this destructive, rattling monologue of Henry standing on a horse or stylized horse, giving the report of the battle. And the battle is a mixture of sexual arousement, of aggression, of violence, as all sort of coming into one stream of aggressive language. Allow me to close my brief panorama with one last thought. And this by the thought that sort of might accompany you since I've started about 25 minutes ago. And this question is, if I try myself as a mind reader, why should we care? Why should we care about instrumentalizing Shakespeare for forming political identities? I try to answer this every time to my students. They find my answers less convincing, so let me have a try with you. I think at the 21st century, we find ourselves on a global scale in a historical and political moment where in many states across the globe, the idea of a liberal society, of an open discourse of minds and ideas is at a terrible danger. And we see the rise of a populism that really is aiming at destroying this kind of political culture. If Germany has achieved anything in the 20th century, it would not be on the economical level, it would not be on the intellectual level, but it would be the establishment of a constitutional system whose main goal is to protect the weak and to protect civil rights. And I'm very much concerned to see with the last election results in Germany the rise of populist movements that resemble comparable movements in many other countries I know of. But what worries me equally is to see in popular culture the rise of mythical tales that foster these kinds of developments. I don't know to what extent Game of Thrones is also popular in India. I gather from your chuckling that it is. But sort of what happened through this 8-season mega mythical tale of a fictional past is the establishment of an imagery that really starts to percolate and to invade our political thinking. It's not only the idea of an iron throne. This thing looks so uncomfortable that it really is not very desirable. But if you look at other symbols, like the idea of a wall, a firm border that bars the dead and the sort of unreconciled past, is something we see very uncannily reappearing in many, many political systems. And I think it's only the most obvious, and therefore it's a simple shot, but I'll nevertheless do it. It's only the most obvious example that the American president is not stupid enough to tweet himself as winter is coming. I mean, sort of, obviously he has never seen the series because otherwise he this is not the best position to frame himself in. But what I'm afraid of is that this kind of popular culture tales, like the Shakespearean history plays did in Shakespeare's days and did in so many other periods, provide the mindset, the imagery, provide a mental landscape that creates political concepts and categories that have very severe consequences. So therefore, I think it should matter to us. We should, as scholars, as historians, as literary scholars, we should be fully aware of the tales we are told because they might bear consequences. Thank you very much for your attention.
Now I'll also invite Dr. Taubert to please come, and the house is open to questions.
Thanks, Dr. Taubert and Professor Marx, for such a wonderful panoramic journey of German drama and its engagement with Shakespeare, late 18th century onwards. First, a question for you, Dr. Taubert, that you basically looked at the technology, and in fact, actually, technology comes in later as the word technology. I think late 18th century in Germany and France particularly, we're looking at the naturalist movement, and it had a very major impact on the whole process of writing itself. For instance, in France, Balzac dedicates his novel to a naturalist. And I'm just wondering that where in fiction we have a very, very sharply political series of novels that we can get, novels that have present to our society through the realist landscape, through the realist lens. In drama, I would think it is slightly different in the sense that, you know, particularly, I mean, I also have Schiller in mind. So when we move on from the late 18th to the early 19th century, so where it's at the level of spectacle, you know, I mean, the use of technology gives us a lot. You know, how we can present the fairies and the pastoral scenes in Midsummer Night's Dream. But I would want you to comment a little bit about what you think. Does it dampen the politics a little, or do you think in the early 19th century, where at least on stage, not much was happening, so do you think that Shakespeare becomes a way of kind of, you know, doing something constructive, or do you think that you know, it takes away from what you know, people wanted to say, and it's more about the whole structure of morality?